feel like life's thrown you into the deep end and you're just trying to keep your head above water? Whether it's a career change, an empty nest, or even just trying to figure out who you are beyond all the roles that you've played. Midlife is full of these transitions, but the usual advice, it'll all work out. But that doesn't help when you need real tools to navigate the chaos. Today, we're sharing life transition strategies to help you not just keep afloat, but actually enjoy the swim. Stick around and don't forget to hit subscribe for more real insights. Today, we're joined by Linda Rossetti. Linda is an author, Harvard MBA, and an expert in helping people through life's biggest transitions. Linda's latest book, Dancing with Disruption, breaks down these big shifts and shows us how to find opportunity, even when things feel chaotic. She's here today because, let's be honest, midlife can be full of these disruptive moments, and Linda has the experience and wisdom to help guide us through them. Good morning, Linda. I'm so happy to have you here today. You have had such an incredible journey from your role in corporate leadership and now to becoming this guiding voice for those of us who are facing some of life's biggest changes. And I'd really like to start there. What made you decide to explore transitions on a deeper level? Was it a moment from your own life, or maybe a story from someone that you helped that really made an impression on you?
Well, Holly, first of all, it's great to be here with you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I'm so honored. And your question is a great one. And I think the answer is both, right? But it starts with my story. More than a decade ago, I found myself in a place that was frankly terrifying. I thought there was something wrong with me. I remember at the time I was serving as an executive in a very large global company, and I was a direct report to the CEO. And I remember sitting in his staff meeting one day, and it was like an all-day affair, and we had this agenda. We were going through all these very weighty things. And I remember sitting there saying, this is it? I've worked this hard for this? And it was shocking because I had worked 6 days a week, 14-hour days for 20 years to get in that room. And all of a sudden, it was as if the ground fell out from underneath me. I was like, what is going on? And my first thought was, my goodness, there's something wrong with me. And as I turned to others for kind of counsel and advice, like, what should I do? They just were like, they didn't they didn't really honor what was happening with me. They're like, oh, just go get another job. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. And I was like, no, 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 no. There's something here. There's something going on. And the fact of how awful I felt and the response from those around me really kind of piqued my curiosity. I'm like, wait a minute. I cannot be the first person on this planet to be going through this. And so that led me, right? I had at that point had worked for many years and knew that the answer is always around. We just have to go find it. And so I started to speak with other people. And what I learned, and I was very fortunate, right? I had a big network, and one of the people I outreached to was a gentleman who owned this national outplacement firm. And I said, I want to talk to people who are in transitions. And he's like, oh, let us be your learning lab. And he let me talk to all these people who were floating in and out of his business because they had, been downsized by a company or something had happened. And so I started to speak with people who were navigating what seemed like pretty common changes in their lives. And I was just intrigued and fascinated by the pain and the shame that went with it. And we really didn't have any vocabulary for it in our society. So long-winded answer to your question, Holly, but yes, it touched me and it got me going, and others inspired me to keep going. And now I am 10 years beyond that. I've written 2 books. I've spoken with thousands of people. I talk all the time about this notion because I believe we as a society really misunderstand these moments of transition in our lives, and to our detriment, I would say, because as I've learned from all this research, that these can be moments of expansion and and beautiful recentering that too often we miss. And so my work is all about changing that conversation so that more and more people really look at these as great opportunities, not ignoring the emotions that go with it, but really advance along a trajectory that can be beneficial to them.
It's interesting because I feel that the book made a really great bridge from being not just about business and our work life, but also about how our personal life, those two things many times intersect. And at that point, it feels huge. The change feels huge.
It's so true, Holly. And you know what I learned early on, right? I sat and I just listened to people and I asked them what was the transition that was happening for them. And what came back to me was a variety of circumstances, right? Somebody might have suddenly lost a spouse, or they had a health crisis, or they needed to have a geographic move, or there was a financial crisis in their family, or they had a miscarriage, or they welcomed a new baby, or they were getting remarried, like thousands and thousands of issues. And what I learned was that regardless of the initiating circumstance, right, and there can be hundreds more than the ones I just listed, the process of going through transition is exactly the same, right? So in our society, I remember when I first started doing this work, I would do speaking engagements and people would come in early and they'd say, could you put me with the people who are going through divorce? Or could you put me with the people who just welcomed another child, or the people who are going through fertility challenges, whatever it is. And what I quickly learned is that those initiating circumstances are simply that. They bring us to this opportunity for a choice. And it's how we respond in that moment that really sets the groundwork for what can be an incredible opportunity. And even if we isolate and say, oh, I want to sit with the people who, just got remarried, the people in the room, regardless of their initiating circumstances, will be going through the exact same process.
I didn't think of it like that, but you're right, because a disruption is a disruption. And that is the big theme of your book. Can you just maybe break that down a little bit for anybody watching?
Yes, of course. And so I use the word disruption to mean a break or an interruption. And it's really in the book thought of as how we think about ourselves. So a break or interruption in our self-concept. And that can really be caused by any one of a number of things in life, including, we could be standing in the checkout line at the supermarket and something just sends us in a different direction. And I think that that's the beauty is the book is called Dancing with Disruption. And what it tries to do is it sets the conversation with this universal on-ramp, right? That the book is for anyone who is navigating a time of uncertainty in their life. And it isn't, just for uncertainty because of X or Y. It's anyone who's navigating uncertainty. And so what it then does is begins to build a set of vocabulary based on those experiences of uncertainty or instability. And that's really what I love to talk about, because I think we don't talk about it enough in ways that are inclusive and welcoming. What I've learned from my work is that nearly everyone on the planet will go through periods of uncertainty, in spite of what it might look like from the outside. Everyone does. And, the more that we're willing to kind of elevate that conversation, the better off we'll be.
Well, and I have a copy of the book right here. When I found it and I started reading it, selfishly speaking, I feel like I'm going through some changes in my own life. And I think what I loved most about it is that you give some, actual action steps that I could take. And it made it feel like disruption doesn't always have to be negative, right?
That's so true, right? Disruption can come from something that's positive, right? Somebody can welcome a new child to a family, or they can get a promotion, or they can make a move that's a geographic move that's very good, right? So any kind of disruption can be this invitation for something more. And what the book does is in every chapter, it shares stories, like real world stories of people who've navigated disruptions. And then it offers an exercise in each of the chapters. And these exercises are extensively tested tools that I found through my research really help people move along the progression of making big changes. And so the book is trying to illustrate how other people have experienced the challenge of change, but it also gives these very practical steps that people can take, as a place of reflection or action, depending on their readiness. And the other thing that's important in the book is that my story of change is shared in every chapter as well. So I'm in it with the reader, right? It's scary. It was terrifying at times, and yet I continued, and the reader gets to see how that evolved and began to change my world, and how I was able to meet the challenges of change differently.
That you mentioned you being in the book, and that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about it. There was a part where you mentioned to your mom how you were feeling, and I felt like maybe she was just like, yeah, it's just a midlife crisis.
Yes. She was, I remember her saying, pish posh, this is nothing, Linda, just move on. And she, among all the others, I'm like, no, there's something here. And it took a long while for me to really think about how her reaction to me was influencing my willingness to wade through this, right? I think that we all kind of carry the expectations from our world, our households, our families, the communities we live in, the schools we go to. And that very often shapes how we respond. And part of the book is really me trying to get closer to that dismissal, right? And saying, no, it's important enough for me to act on it. And hey, I'd like your support, which, in the book, it's kind of funny. That's hard to get from my mom.
I think maybe too, it was just that generation. They didn't really have time
Yeah.
to have these sort of feelings. Life was happening. They had children to raise. They had a house and a husband. It's like, you're going to have to get over yourself. But I don't feel that I'm in that place right now. I need a little support.
Holly, do you want to share what's up on your side? Are you in the comfortable place that you
Oh,
want to talk
gosh,
about
sure.
that?
Yeah, I think it is about a career and changing from one job to another and, trying different things. For example, that was one of the reasons why I started this podcast and YouTube channel, was because I was so curious as to what other women my age, I'm 55,
Mhm.
and I feel like I'm at this point in my life where either I'm going to explore other opportunities, or I was going to get stuck in this job till I was 65 and ready to retire. And I think it sounds like you had moments like this too, where you looked around and you're like, I can't do this for another 10 years.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of this other woman in the book, Seema. And she was somebody who at one point was working in the San Francisco Bay Area. And she had been doing, the same thing really since she had gotten out of college, right? And it wasn't that she disliked it, but it was a lot. And she had some challenges. Her mom had gotten a cancer diagnosis, and it added a lot of pressure to what was already kind of a very stressful job. And she said at one point, she's like, I don't know. I don't believe in this anymore. Like, it isn't like the passion that I had. It isn't there. If this is all about making another buck for the partner, it has to be more if I go to work. And she wasn't judging the people for whom it was really exciting. She was just raising her awareness to the fact that it wasn't for her kind of holding the water that it once did. And I think that that's a big part of the work that I've done, which is honoring the awareness as it grows, right? All of a sudden we become aware that for Seema, the job wasn't fitting correctly anymore with where she was in her personal progression. And recognizing that and then acting on it really are two different things. And I try to parse that out in the book, right? Because there's a lot of work that we do just to recognize that, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't work for me anymore. And then there's a whole other set of activities that are required to say, well, what do I do about that, right? How do I take what that was and address a blank slate? And I think that that's the really fun part of the book, is that, each of the 10 chapters has a to-do, right? It has an action that we can take that really begins to help people put shape around what can be next. And that's what I love most about the book, is that I love to read and I'm very curious, as you can tell, but sometimes I really struggle with what do I do now that I finished? It was a great read, but what do I do? And I didn't want to leave the readers with that. So that's why the book, each chapter has a to do that's really intended to help people shape and have some real progress steps to do even after they finish the book.
I agree, and I think that that's what makes your book a little different because I feel like I've read very helpful books at times, but then when you're done, that was just the end of it, and um, and I think part of it too, personally, is that when you get to this point in your life, it's your job, and it's also my husband and I have an empty nest, and we have concerns always for your parents. And there's a lot of change that comes at this time in our lives. And I haven't even mentioned, menopause, which is a big change for a lot of women. And I feel all of these changes and transitions just reach this point, and I don't know if we don't know which one to tackle first, or we don't even know who we are at this point. And so I think that can be a big issue for so many women at this stage of their lives.
No question, Holly. You know what I learned in my research? And there's a gentleman who is now deceased, but he was a professor at Columbia for many years. His name was Jack Mesereau, and I use his work a lot in the book. Um, but he said there's really two activities we have to do when we arrive at this point. Like, well, wait a minute, who am I, right? Empty nest, menopause, parent responsibilities, lots of things, lots of change. And he said, there's practical level, right? Which is this notion of, well, what do I need to do, right? I may need an income. I need to care for somebody. There's some very practical things. But he also said there's a parallel level, like another swim lane, which is really our emotional response to those changes. And in the book, there's a whole chapter on how we respond emotionally, because what I learned in my work is that when we get to periods of instability, our physiological and emotional response is to keep us safe. And very often, what happens at that time is that our emotions mobilize to staple our feet to the floor, right? They don't want us to move because our emotive system says that's safety, don't move. When in fact, what we need to do is move, right? We need to move our concept of ourself and what's going on. We need to begin to move that. And so I use this technique in the book called HAIL, which is HAIL, like hailing a cab before Uber and Lyft and all the rest. And what it does is it helps us reframe emotions. And I find that that is an essential tool, right? So if we're out navigating major disruption in our lives, we have to not only work on the practical, okay, what am I going to do next Tuesday? We also have to work on really reframing or getting a new perspective on the emotions that are active with us at that time. Because if we don't do the emotion stuff, we tend to go in loops. I use this example in the book, maybe you'll remember it, about climbing a mountain, right? And, if we are up on the mountain, we can do these, trails that basically go around the horizontal of the mountain. But if we don't introduce new techniques to manage or be with the emotions that are with us, we'll never ascend. All we'll keep doing is keep going around and around and around. And we might think we're making great progress because, one time around, it might be really sunny on the mountain, and the next time it might be cloudy or what have you, right? So we think we're doing a great job because we're going around and around, but we're never really kind of gaining any altitude. And that's what the work of trying to think about emotions in a new way really does.
Well, I think that's part of the problem is that we think we could do things or handle things the same way that we always did.
Right.
And it doesn't work. And that's where I think we get frustrated and we find ourselves getting stuck because we're right. We're not going up. We're just kind of running in circles is how it feels sometimes. Is that, what did you hail? Is that part of the incubator toolkit?
Yeah, so Hale is in chapter 6 of the new book, right? The Dancing with Disruption. And it is this 4-step technique that basically asks somebody questions. And what it does is it forces somebody to take a new perspective, right? The questions kind of move somebody around an issue so that by the end they have a new perspective. And so the technique teaches people how to reframe. And that is something that is essential, right? It is part of the critical skills one needs, from my research to navigate this process really successfully. I was going to tell you another story, and there was a woman that you might enjoy. Her story in the book, her name is Lakshmi, and she was somebody who I really loved talking to her because she was somebody who had spent many, many years in a career. And in her 30s, she was having like severe headaches, a lot of physical challenges. And she said, finally I realized, she asked herself, what is my body trying to tell me that I don't know yet? She ultimately really came to the conclusion that what she was doing wasn't really what she wanted to be doing. And that was a very hard realization because she was somebody who had put many, many years into studying and then working in this field. And that comes with a lot of baggage to even get to that awareness, right? Because it's like, well, how can I start over? And, how can I have so much to lose if I give up on all this stuff. And she said one thing that I just thought was so interesting. She said, I don't know what to do next. If I agree that I'm not in the right place, I don't know what to do next. And she said, I never even dreamed outside of this. And I think that it was so powerful, right? That so many of us, for whatever reason, we build these lives and we never even envision outside of it. And I think that that's probably the scariest part, which is having to think outside of the way we've gotten to know ourselves. And a lot of times the people around us also have a need for us to stay the same, right? We're part of their safety. If we're stable, we're helping them be okay. And so it comes with a lot of baggage to ask these questions and to have the courage to say, I want to explore this.
I remember reading that part in the book where you talked about how society forces us to identify ourselves as such. And, I'm a mom, so I feel like I've always have to identify as a mom. Or like the woman that you just spoke of, her career identified her, and she didn't think that you can have another identity, that you could, you don't always have to be that person, especially if it doesn't feel right and you're making yourself sick over it.
It's so true. And, in the book, I introduced some, really what we're talking about is growth in the adult lifespan, right? And particularly those of us who are parents or caring adults for younger children, whatever our titles are, we're very interested in developmental milestone in the young, right? So if a child doesn't meet a milestone, we say, oh my goodness, we need early intervention. Like we are on it, like quickly, like, oh my goodness. But once somebody hits about 20 or 25, we don't say a word about it. And yet adult growth is continuing to recenter how we think about ourselves, right? That is what adult growth is. And so this notion of I have this identity and it has to be solid and in stone is really kind of against this notion that everything on the planet grows. And so the people who navigate transitions well are those that recognize that adding to our recentering our identity isn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What it is it's building on a beautiful foundation we've all established. And it allows us to be enlivened and to contribute in ways that we may never have even imagined. And so it isn't a takeaway. Like a lot of people think when we're navigating a transition, there's a loss. I've found that to be patently wrong. What it is an expansion. It's like we've had a foundation and now we get to build a house on top of the foundation. And really that's the promise that's out here and why I do my work, Holly, because we don't think of it at all like that. My first reaction when I was thinking, it's like, oh my goodness, what's wrong with me, right? I felt that there was something terribly wrong. It wasn't, and by the way, no one I turned to at the time said the word growth to me. Not one. Like experts, deeply skilled people. No one said, Linda, this is growth. But what it frankly is this invitation to grow. And that's why, people like Lakshmi, who I was just talking about, she left that job and for a moment got what we will call a sustaining job, right? She needed to have income. And so she She quickly got, a place where she could earn some income, but she could also catch her breath. And she said, that ultimately led her to some more jobs. But she said, the fascinating thing is like people think I'm funny and a good leader. She said that was never on the horizon. So she's like, this process, while it was terrifying, has introduced me to pieces of me that are extraordinary that I never knew. And she's like, and those pieces of me are effortless, right? I'm simply in a place and I get to be me. And I think that there's a beauty to that I hope people hear, Holly, because it can be terrifying. I remember sitting in that room with my boss, like, terrifying. What do I do now? What is this? And yet, if you use like books like mine, there's some steps you can take. It begins to really broaden, and people, beautiful parts of people come forward that perhaps we hit the mute button on early on, or we just didn't know were part of us. That's really the beauty of this, right? That transition isn't about loss. It's about adding to this wonderful start and realizing what that can create in our lives. And frankly, then what we can give to others, right? So many of us are in roles as parents, or we're in community roles where we're giving to others. And our ability to do that goes up exponentially.
I loved that notion about her just trying to catch her breath.
Yes.
Because isn't that kind of where it all starts? You look around and you're like, I don't think I could do this anymore. I wanted to ask you just some very practical steps about how we can rediscover ourselves. Like she rediscovered that she was actually a funny person and that people liked her, and that choosing growth. Like that was, I highlighted that because I'm like, how do we choose that? What is that block that stops us from saying, yeah, this is okay. I have so much more to offer.
And I think there's two things we can do right off the bat, and they're simple, right? The first thing I always ask people to do is to think about the expectations they hold for themselves, right? And we can give it a quick minute, right? Say, oh well, I have the expectation that I'm going to be a good parent, or I'm going to be a good neighbor, or I'm going to be a great worker, whatever it is, right? But the first step, as we write down those expectations, right? It's a wonderful exercise, because after we go through the first couple, it's amazing what comes out, right? I did a workshop last night with a group of women who were, I would say, anywhere from 40 to 58, like in that age range. And, one lady said, I had this need to, be perfect and always available. And she said, I think I read about it like when I was in my 20s. And she's like, I don't know why I decided to adopt it and bring it along, but it's been with me ever since. So I say that somewhat in a silly manner, but a first great step is to recognize what's walking with us, right? Because what we can do with that is we can recognize that some of that is beyond its useful life, right? We can say, yeah, well, maybe that isn't really what I need at this moment. And so I think that that is a first step, because it will allow us to ask ourselves new questions, right? Which is, well, what are the expectations I want to have for myself? So while it seems like a very simple kind of exercise, it's amazing how revealing it is, right? Because it can give us this cornucopia of what we are carrying, and allow us to say, maybe that one is beyond its useful life. And maybe that then gives us an opening to recognize something that's missing or that we hadn't thought of. So that's a good very first step. Just give some time to the expectations that we carry. The other thing that I would say is to really do a thought on the emotions that are coming up for us, right? So, we're at this point of instability, and say, two steps. One is, what are the emotions that are coming up, right? They can be anything, and list them, like name them, right? Naming them is, if you do get the book in chapter 6, that's the first step. We name the emotions. I'm afraid. I have regret. I feel ashamed. I don't know how to, I don't know how to answer the question when somebody says, "What are you up to?" I have tons of anxiety. I don't know what I'm going to do if I can't do this job. I don't know how I'm going to care for my family, right? All of the emotions that are present. But then we push it one more step and we ask ourselves, how are those emotions influencing us? And that is a very powerful step, right? So, Holly, if can I ask you to play with me if we practice with this for a second?
Yeah, yes.
So I wonder if we take the current change that you're thinking through, what are the emotions that are coming up for you?
Fear, and I know that that's a big part of the book. Uncertainty, belief in myself, and it just feels, the way I could describe it is, I don't feel that I'm grounded at this point in time.
Perfect. Okay, so you mentioned four,
Hmm.
like not being grounded or afraid, and why don't you choose one of those four to take to the next step? Which one would you like to play with?
Fear.
Okay. And so if I asked you, let's think about fear for a minute. How does the emotion of fear influence you?
It stops me in my tracks. It keeps me from moving.
And so perfect answer and not surprising, right? It does that to so many of us, right? And I'm sure all of your listeners are shaking their head like, yeah, that happens to me all the time. And so what this technique is intended to do is to help us ask additional questions for ourselves, which is, okay, um, am I going to let fear stop me? Right? Am I willing to let that happen today? Right? It begins to help us put some distance between fear as an emotion, as an impermanent state. Right? It isn't a trait. Right? We're not fearful. We're not a fearful person. We're just experiencing fear now. And so, what the simple two questions are intended to do is to help us begin to get a different perspective on it so we are not stalled by it. Because then you can begin to think more about what might be possible as you move beyond the fear.
Yeah. I believe you had mentioned something like using fear as a motivator and not a barrier.
Right. A lot of the work in the book is trying to, in the beginning when I did my first book, right? My first book was called Women and Transition, and my second book was called Dancing with Disruption. And my first book was all about trying to recognize the barriers that are in our way to progress when we're going through, big changes. What I found is that, like in the beginning, I thought I was like a good student and I was going to like inventory all the barriers and then give an answer like, okay, here's how we get beyond the barriers. And what I learned is that the barriers very often never go away. What we need to do is change our response to them, right? So it isn't like, if we teach you the technique of HAIL, right, which is the emotional reframing technique in the book, it isn't as if I can make fear disappear, right? But what I can do is make it kind of stand next to you and not block you. And I always describe it this way, it's like for me, sadness is an emotion that's constantly with me as I'm navigating instability. And on some days, it's as if sadness is this rope that I'm just clinging to and it's like whipping me around willy-nilly any direction it wants, right? It's in charge. But if we use some of the techniques in the book, like this notion of naming an emotion and then considering the influence it has on us, what it allows us to do to sadness, in my experience, is we can take sadness and that rope and drop it on the ground next to us, right? It doesn't go away, it's still right there. But what it doesn't do is have power over me. And that's the key, right? That's the key when we think about how do we move through this. Yes, there are practical steps we have to take. Like, I'm no longer going to be a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker. I need to earn a job. I need to earn a living, right? Okay, that's practical. But there's also these emotional things that we don't want those to hold us to be the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, right? So we want to neutralize the emotions' power over us. And so the book is really working on two levels. It's trying to help us think about, if I'm not a butcher, a baker, candlestick maker, what am I going to be? And then the other level it's working on is to try to help us get a different response to the barriers like emotions that can stand in our way. And so it makes a good effort on both. I can tell you that.
That's a really good visual, though, with sadness. I think for a lot of people, sadness, especially as we get a little bit older, there's a lot of loss that takes place. Sadness can be a big part of our lives, but the fact that it could be with us on a daily basis, but like you said, it just doesn't have to have this chokehold on us all the time.
Exactly. And I think that that's, part of what I've learned in my work. And I don't want to go all sciencey on you, but I have done an extraordinary amount of work. I'm actually almost finished my doctorates in human development based on this work, right? I've been studying this a lot. What I've learned is that a lot of these emotions mobilize when our kind of identity gets dislodged in some way, right? It could be that, we have an empty nest, right? We're used to parenting and all of a sudden we have an empty nest and somehow we can't really think through that piece of ourselves because it's changing. And these emotions really are artifacts of that instability. They're themselves not a problem. All they're doing is really trying to signal us that there's a change. And we don't often we don't think of it that way in our society. A lot of times we pathologize them. Like we take my sadness and we say, oh my goodness, sadness is a problem. Let's work on sadness. When in fact, I found that if we can work on the underlying changes that are happening as part of kind of this transition, then we can handle sadness by the technique I just showed you. Let's just put it on the ground next to us. What we want is we don't want it to have power over us, but we don't want it to go away because it's an important signal. It might come up again to help us think that it's a time to pay attention again. So we
Yeah.
don't want to bypass it. We don't want to learn to ignore it all the time, but we don't want it to be a barrier itself.
I brought it up earlier and I want to bring it up again. Do you see a parallel between what women experience in menopause and the broader life transitions that we're going through at this time? It just feels that this is the point where these things all come together. And do you have any strategies that can help women sort of navigate this time?
Absolutely. Right. Yes. Do I think that this is all that menopause brings us to this moment? Absolutely. Right. Menopause, there are so many physical, emotional, physiological symptoms of progressing through menopause. I think that it in and of itself can be the need to think about transitioning, right? And all that's inviting us to do is to think about a new way to know ourselves. And certainly as we move beyond our ability to have children, that's a totally new way to know ourselves because many of us have parented or, been in a caring role for a younger person, oftentimes older persons too. So of course, yes, I think that menopause is a giant initiating circumstance for transition, right? But we need to accept it, right? Transitions never occur, right? And we should talk about vocabulary, which I can't believe we've been talking for 40 minutes. I haven't mentioned a vocabulary, right? But transitions never occur because they're forced on us, right? There's two very important vocabulary words in this that I think are very appropriate to talk about under the umbrella of menopause, right? And those two words are change and transition. Changes occur when we want to make an alteration or a variation on something that's known, right? Changes are, I need a new apartment. I need a new spouse. I need a new hairstyle, right? It can be anything, but changes are really, when we're talking about instability, changes are really relied upon to make an alteration or a variation, but our self concept is fixed under the umbrella of change. Transitions occur when there is this shift in what holds value and meaning to us. And they require us to re examine our assumptions about our identity, our capacity, and our values. Right? So that assumes that there's instability in our self concept for a time. Right? So in menopause, right, when we have symptoms of menopause, right, I'll talk for myself, hot flashes, weight gain, sleeplessness. I can go on, right? And I'm just 60. I have two college age students, right? So I'm relatively new to an empty nest, right? Loads of change going on my side. But at this period of time, we need to think about, Are we responding with changes, meaning we're making alterations or variations, or are we willing to re-examine the assumptions that we hold for ourselves? And if it's the latter, menopause can be an incredibly enlivening period of our lives. But we have to choose how we respond. One is with a fixed self concept. I am a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker. That's what I'll always be. I may not be a working butcher or baker, but I'm still that person. Versus somebody who's willing to re-examine their assumptions about, how they think about themselves in the world. Those people are making a transition, and that is the crew that gets this expansive, enlivening perch. And so I think transitions are a choice for those who are navigating menopause. They don't always happen because the simple dint of our bodies going through physiological changes will not allow us to get to a transition. We have to make the choice to re-examine those assumptions. And that's really the work that I am trying to share as I write these books is we have this lovely invitation to re-examine. And now we might re-examine and look at something and say, yeah, it's all good. I'm not making any changes. But we might re-examine and say, yeah, you know what? 20% of that no longer makes any sense. Boop, that's away. Now I'm going to build more. Right. So this notion of if we choose to re-examine, menopause can be an enormously positive and exciting period of our lives.
Well, thank you for saying that because I think sometimes women need to hear that type of encouragement because we feel so blindsided by the emotional and physical aspect of what we're going through. And thank you for saying that.
Of course. And again, I do think that we don't have any vocabulary, right? This notion of thinking differently about changes and transition. We don't talk at all about that in our society. But also this notion of needing to have new techniques to navigate the emotions that are so important for us, that's essential as well. And I think that that's something that, I would love to leave your listeners with, which is, we don't want to have our emotions having power over us, right? We want to be able to drop that rope of sadness on the ground next to us
Mhm.
because in that we can take from that emotion the instincts, the signaling that it's trying to help us, but we aren't controlled by them. And I think that that's an important progression that we make in transition if we're willing to walk this way.
Just one more thing before we go. And I think you talked a lot about the importance of community
Yes.
and, having people on our side during these points in our lives. When you're feeling sort of stuck and lonely, how do you communicate that to others that you kind of need some support and that you need a little bit of company?
Well, I advocate in the book that we need to have kind of a kitchen cabinet around us that we can outreach to. And it, by the way, it isn't our spouses and our best friends, right? It's actually others, right? Who can see us outside of our family's needs for us, right? So it's having some folks that they can be folks that you meet at the public library or people that you meet in your neighborhood. You can go for a walk, right? It doesn't have to be the best buddy, but what they need to be able to do is listen to you and really see you. Because I believe after doing this research and work that we meet ourselves during transitions through our connections with others because the folks that we interact with, we might say, I was a butcher and a baker for my entire career, but now I think I'm going to go in a direction of teaching art. I'm going to go in a different direction. And the people who aren't vested in our prior identity are able to say, oh, wow, tell me more about that. And those are the people, right? Those are the people with whom we learn about ourselves, right? As we begin to say it out loud, we begin to dream out loud, they really help us because they certainly listen, but they can respond and ask us questions because ultimately, as we move, that's what we're looking for, right? It isn't, it isn't, it isn't to the exclusion of other people around us, but we need to find people who we can practice this new thinking with. And those are the people that can be the most helpful. And it's interesting as I've done all this research and I host groups a lot. I host a free group on the first Monday of every month from noon to 1 East Coast time. You can find out information on my website through the Winchester Public Library in Massachusetts. Um, these are people who are unfamiliar to each other, but who come together and share. Similar, Holly, to what you're doing through your work here, right? Which is you're creating a platform for people to share. And that is what we need from community, right? We need a platform where we can connect with others um, and practice out loud this new thinking.
That is, and I'd love to end it there to practice out loud because I think we get so caught up in the day to day that you're right. When you share those ideas with somebody at the library or the coffee shop, or like, oh, I'm starting, I'm taking a new class, and they're excited and interested in you, and they don't connect you to a former self.
Exactly. And again, ultimately this isn't one swing of the bat and we go from what we were to the new thing. It's a real walk, and we have to practice and then see what we learn and practice again. And the practice is as simple as saying it out loud to another person.
Beautiful. Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This conversation means a lot to me, and I'm hoping that it can mean a lot to any woman or men, because I know men go through these types of transitions too. And it's important to have these types of conversations so that we could recognize these things in ourselves and in others.
Absolutely. Holly, thank you so much for all that you do and for your willingness to have me join you to talk about this. And I greatly appreciate it.
Where are some of the places that we could find you if anybody wants to know more about what you've got going on?
The three easiest places are LinkedIn, right? If anyone has access to LinkedIn, I'm Linda Rossetti at LinkedIn. My last name is tricky, 2 S's and 2 T's. It's a little tricky, but thank you for having it correct on the screen. I have a website, lindarossetti.com. That's a place that has an enormous amount of resources, but also at Amazon or any place where you get your books, even at your public library. My books are at most public libraries. So you can find them in my book, Dancing with Disruption and Women in Transition. Both of those are ways to get at me. But I'm always available. If people have questions, don't hesitate to outreach. Again, I really applaud all the work that you're doing. It's a great honor to be here. And I really thank you for taking the time to listen.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on Real Insights. If you want to hear more about how other women navigate big life transitions, order your copy of Empart, Real Stories, Real Wisdom, Real Menopause on Amazon today. And don't forget to join the conversation at joinempart.com. Until next time, remember that menopause is a journey, but you're not alone.